The scent of stale beer and exhaust fumes clung to the air like a second skin, a familiar odor to the patrons of the growling engine. Laughter, coarse and guttural, ricocheted off the brick walls, punctuated by the clinking of glasses and the rumble of distant engines. Tonight, however, a new sound cut through the din. A small, clear voice. Ezra, no older than 7, stood before a man whose frame seemed to consume all available light. The man, a Hell's Angel named Iron Mike, was a formidable figure, all leather, chrome, and a beard that could house small birds. Mike, mid-sip of a frothy dark ale, paused, his glass hovering inches from his lips. "My mom said you'd help me," Ezra stated, his voice unwavering despite the cacophony around them. He clutched a worn red backpack to his chest. "She said you're my father." The laughter died a sudden choked death. A hush, thick and unnatural, descended upon the bar. Mike's eyes, usually a steely gray, widened imperceptibly. He looked around, as if expecting to find a hidden camera, a prank unfolding. But the faces staring back at him were a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. "Kid, you got the wrong guy," Mike rumbled, finally lowering his glass with a soft thud. His voice, usually a command, held a tremor of disbelief. Ezra didn't flinch. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a creased envelope, its edges softened by countless touches. "She said to give you this." Mike hesitated, then took the letter, his calloused fingers dwarfing the delicate paper. He tore it open, his brow furrowed in confusion. The handwriting was elegant, a stark contrast to the rough environment. As he read, his face drained of color, the tattoo of a snarling wolf on his neck seeming to pale with it. The letter spoke of a fleeting summer, a brief connection forged in shared vulnerability, a life-altering secret kept for years. It spoke of his mother, Sarah, now gone, and it spoke of Ezra. A low growl escaped Mike's throat. His gaze swept over the boy, taking in the startling resemblance he hadn't noticed a moment before, the same stubborn set to the jaw, the identical flecks of gold in their otherwise dark eyes. He felt a phantom punch to the gut. A son. He had a son. Then his eyes caught the last paragraph, and the color fled completely, leaving his face a mask of ash. His hand, which had been resting on the bar, clenched into a fist, knuckles white. The letter wasn't just about Ezra. It was about him. "Mike, what the hell is it?" demanded Viper, one of his lieutenants, his voice edged with concern. Mike didn't answer. He reread the final lines, his breath catching in his chest. Sarah's meticulous account detailed a slow, insidious decline, a pattern of symptoms he dismissed as age and the rigors of his lifestyle. She had observed his girlfriend, Roxy, administering seemingly innocuous supplements, subtly altering his meals. Sarah had worked as a medical transcriptionist, and her letter contained precise dates, types of medication, and even laboratory reports, all pointing to a calculated long-term poisoning. Roxy, Sarah had written, had a history of exploiting older men and had been asking pointed questions about Mike's life insurance policy for months. Sarah, fearing for her son's future and Mike's life, had taken the drastic step of documenting everything, knowing her own time was short. Mike's vision blurred with a mix of fury and nauseating revelation. Roxy. His Roxy. The woman he'd shared his bed with, his life with, for the past 2 years. "Where is she?" Mike's voice was a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The bartender, a burly man named Gus who had seen more than his share of barroom brawls, pointed a trembling finger towards the back office. "She went to check the inventory, Mike. Said she wasn't feeling so good." Mike was already moving, a force of nature unleashed. The other angels, sensing the shift in the atmosphere from shock to imminent violence, cleared a path. Ezra, small and stoic, remained rooted to his spot, watching the unfolding drama with wide, intelligent eyes. Mike kicked open the office door. Roxy, a bottle of vodka clutched in her hand, jumped, spilling some of its contents onto her silk blouse. Her usually perfectly coiffed blonde hair was slightly askew. "Mike, baby, what's wrong?" she purred, her voice laced with feigned innocence. He stalked towards her, the letter still clutched in his hand, its edges crinkling under the pressure. "You poisoned me, you snake." Roxy's face, usually so composed, contorted into a mask of pure terror. She glanced at the vodka bottle, then at a small, unmarked vial on the desk beside her. "What are you talking about, Mike? Have you been drinking too much?" Her voice rose to a shrill pitch, He slammed the letter down on the desk, scattering papers. Sarah knew. She knew everything. His eyes, dark with rage, fixed on the vial. What's in that, Roxy? Her gaze flickered to the vial, then back to him, a desperate calculation playing out in her eyes. She lunged, not for him, but for the vial, her fingers scrambling to snatch it, but Mike was faster. He slapped her hand away, sending the vial skittering across the floor, where it shattered against the wall, its clear liquid quickly absorbed by the dusty carpet. You tried to kill me, didn't you? He snarled, his voice barely a whisper, yet it held more menace than a shout. Roxy scrambled backward, fear overriding any pretense. It wasn't like that, Mike. I needed money. You said you'd never settle down, never get married, and that policy was huge. Her voice was a desperate whine. I was just trying to secure my future. The sound of sirens, faint at first, then growing louder, pierced the sudden silence in the bar. Outside, flashing blue and red lights painted the street in an eerie glow. Someone, perhaps Gus, had called the police. Mike looked from Roxy, trembling on the floor, to the shattered vial, then back to the letter, its accusations screaming at him. He thought of Ezra, standing alone in the bar, a small voice in a loud, dangerous world. His son. The world had just changed, and it had changed with the quiet click of a child's backpack and a mother's last, desperate warning. The letter from Sarah. The sirens wailed, a discordant symphony against the backdrop of the diner's stunned silence. Mike, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, had Roxy pinned to the greasy linoleum. Her struggles, initially fierce, had softened into whimpers as the reality of her exposure set in. Ezra, his small hand still clutching the crumpled envelope, stood a few feet away, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. He seemed unaffected by the drama he had unwittingly unleashed, a silent sentinel amidst the chaos. You tried to kill me, Mike rasped, his voice raw. The words were a choked whisper, yet they reverberated through the diner, each syllable heavy with betrayal. Roxy's reply was a garbled sob, her eyes darting wildly, searching for an escape that wasn't there. Her usually perfectly coiffed blonde hair was now disheveled, strands plastered to her tear-streaked face. The carefully constructed facade of the doting girlfriend had shattered, revealing a desperate, venomous core. The diner door burst open, admitting two uniformed officers. Their gaze swept over the scene. The biker, menacing and formidable, even in his compromised state, the weeping woman beneath him, and the small, composed boy. Their hands instinctively went to their holsters. What in the blazes is going on here? One officer demanded, his voice authoritative, cutting through the residual tension. Mike released Roxy, shoving her roughly away. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling backwards into a booth, her eyes still fixed on him with a mixture of fear and hatred. She tried to poison me, Mike stated, his voice now steady, though laced with an undercurrent of cold fury. He pointed at the scattered vials and the empty syringe on the counter, then at the half-eaten plate of eggs. That's evidence. She's been doing it for months. The officers exchanged a glance, their skepticism evident. Poisoning wasn't the typical biker brawl they usually responded to. But the boy, Ezra, stepped forward, a quiet strength emanating from him that belied his age. My mom said so too, he said, his voice clear. She wrote it in the letter. He held out the envelope, its edges worn from countless readings. One of the officers, a burly man with a kind face, took the letter. As he unfolded the brittle paper, his eyes scanned Sarah's elegant script. He read aloud, his voice gaining incredulity with each sentence. Roxy Vance has been systematically administering a slow-acting neurotoxin, documented proof in the safe deposit box. Account number and key enclosed. The officer's voice trailed off, his eyes widening, as he absorbed the full weight of Sarah's meticulous confession. He looked at Roxy, then at Mike, a sudden understanding dawning in his expression. The other officer, who had been cuffing Roxy, stopped him in motion, his head snapping up. Roxy, hearing her carefully laid plans crumble, let out a guttural scream, lunging towards Mike. But the officers were quicker, restraining her and completing the arrest. As she was led away, Roxy's eyes met Mike's, and in them, he saw not only defeat, but a chilling, unwavering malevolence. With Roxy secured in the patrol car, the diner slowly began to breathe again. The other patrons, who had remained frozen in their seats, began to stir, their hushed whispers filling the space. The officers, now with a clear understanding of the situation, interviewed Mike and Ezra separately. Mike recounted the story, his voice devoid of emotion. a stark contrast to the raw anger he'd felt moments ago. He found himself staring at Ezra, this child who had appeared out of nowhere, bearing a truth that had shattered his world. Ezra, for his part, answered the officer's questions with a quiet dignity, recounting how his mother had instructed him to deliver the letter to Iron Mike if anything happened to her. Later, as the sun began to climb higher, casting long shadows across the street, Mike found himself alone with Ezra in the now empty diner. The smell of stale coffee and fear still lingered in the air. The officers had left, promising to follow up on Sarah's claims. Mike looked at the boy. Really looked at him. Ezra had Sarah's eyes, he realized, a shade of deep, thoughtful blue he hadn't seen in years. The boy, oblivious to the storm raging within Mike, simply sat at the counter, swinging his legs, a half-eaten donut still in his hand. "So," Mike began, his voice rougher than he intended. "Your mom, Sarah, she said I was your father," Ezra nodded, taking a bite of his donut. Crumbs dusted his chin. "She said you were a good man, just a bit lost sometimes." Mike flinched. Lost. That was one way of putting it. He remembered Sarah, a flash of vibrant red hair, a laugh that could chase away the darkest thoughts. Their brief entanglement had been a whirlwind of passion and recklessness, a blur in the haze of his youth. He hadn't thought of her in years, not truly, and now, this, a son who had saved his life. She never told me," Mike said, the words tasting like ash. "She wanted to protect you," Ezra explained, his gaze steady. "And me. She said your life was too dangerous back then, but she wanted me to know who you were, just in case." He gestured to the crumpled envelope. "And she wanted to make sure you were safe." Mike ran a hand over his face, the stubble rough against his palm. His entire life, the one he had meticulously built within the confines of the Hells Angels, felt like it was crumbling. He was a father, and a dead woman, a ghost from his past, had just saved him from a slow, agonizing death. The irony was not lost on him. He looked at Ezra again. This small, unassuming boy who had walked into his life and irrevocably changed it. The world outside the diner, the world of the club, of turf wars and loyalty, suddenly seemed distant, almost irrelevant. A new kind of responsibility, heavy and profound, settled over him. "What now, then?" Mike asked, more to himself than to Ezra. Ezra shrugged, finishing his donut. "Mom said you'd know. She said you always did." Mike stared out the window at the bustling street. The sirens were long gone, but the echo of their urgency remained. His life as Iron Mike of the Hells Angels, the fearsome biker, felt like a distant dream. A new path stretched before him, uncertain and fraught with unknowns, but for the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't realized he'd lost. Hope. A son's secret. The morning air, sharp and invigorating, stung Mike's cheeks, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat that had clung to the previous night. He stood on the porch of what was once his home, the nascent sun painting the weathered wood in burnished gold and amber. The scent of pine and damp earth, once a solace, now felt alien in its familiarity. Beside him, Ezra, small yet resolute, clutched a worn leather satchel. His hazel eyes, a mirroring shade of Mike's own, surveyed the world with an unnerving, preternatural maturity. "Ready, son?" Mike's voice was a gravelly whisper, unfamiliar with the tenderness it now held. The word son felt new on his tongue, a nascent muscle he was just learning to flex. Ezra simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the imposing, wrought iron gates of the clubhouse across the asphalt. The distant growl of an engine vibrated through the ground, a familiar symphony of raw power and untamed spirit. A knot tightened in Mike's chest. This was the moment. The confrontation with his brothers, not merely as Mike, the hardened biker, but as Mike, the father. The gravel driveway seemed to stretch into an impossible distance, each crunch beneath his boots echoing the tremor in his heart. He pushed open the heavy gates, the rusted hinges shrieking a jarring announcement. The yard was already alive with activity. Several steel vipers congregated, polishing chrome, trading jokes, their laughter slicing through the morning quiet. Then they saw him. The mirth evaporated, replaced by a ripple of hushed whispers and probing stares. Hammer, a burly figure with a perpetual scowl that belied a generous heart, and was the first to approach. His eyes, usually alight with mischief, were clouded with concern. "Mike, what in hell happened? We heard about Roxy." He glanced at Ezra, a crease forming between his brows. It's a long story, Hammer, Mike responded, his voice low. He settled a protective hand on Ezra's shoulder, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. And he's central to it. Just then, a sleek black dime glide roared into the yard, followed by a vintage panhead. Bones and Viper dismounted, their faces grim and set. The news clearly had traveled fast. Mike watched their reactions, bracing himself for the inevitable volley of questions, accusations, and judgment. Bones, ever the voice of pragmatism, spoke first. Mike, what's going on? Cops have been asking questions. Roxy's been arrested for attempted murder. What did she do? His gaze flickered to Ezra, a spark of recognition quickly extinguished. She was poisoning me, Mike stated, the words flat, devoid of emotion, for months. To collect on my life insurance. A collective gasp swept through the yard, disbelief warring with anger on their faces. Viper, typically stoic, clenched his jaw. Poisoning you? That venomous bitch. I knew there was something off about her. And it gets richer, Mike continued, his voice laced with bitter irony. He squeezed Ezra's shoulder. This is Ezra, my son. A profound, suffocating silence descended. The only sound was the distant chirping of a bird. Viper's eyes widened, then narrowed. Bones' jaw dropped, then snapped shut. Hammer stared, unblinking, between Mike and Ezra. Sensing the dramatic shift in atmosphere, Ezra finally spoke, his voice clear and surprisingly strong for such a small boy. My mom, Sarah, wrote a letter. She said she never told you about me because you lived a dangerous life, but she said you'd help me. He looked directly at Viper, his gaze unwavering. And she said Roxy was poisoning you. Viper, the unwavering leader of the Steel Vipers, looked utterly stunned. He wasn't Mike's biological father, but had been the closest thing to it, taking Mike under his wing as a young prospect. To be confronted with this, by a child no less, was a profound shock. Sarah, Viper finally managed to stammer. You mean Sarah Miller? From the diner? A faint blush crept up his neck. Mike felt a jolt. Viper knew Sarah? He'd never once mentioned it. The implication swirled in his mind, adding another intricate layer to an already tangled web. Yes, Ezra confirmed, pulling the crinkled letter from his satchel. She said you were good to her, and that you'd be a good father to me. He handed the letter to Viper. Viper took the letter, his hands trembling slightly. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. As he read, his expression morphed from disbelief to a slow, dawning comprehension. He looked up, his gaze meeting Mike's. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. It's true, Mike confirmed, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah. She was my girlfriend briefly years ago. Before I joined the Vipers, I never knew. Viper finished reading, then slowly refolded the letter. He looked at Ezra, a tenderness Mike had never witnessed in the hardened biker's eyes. Sarah. She was a good woman, he murmured, almost to himself. Then his gaze hardened as he looked at Mike. And you, Mike. You never knew you had a son? He paused, then a slow smile spread across his face, a genuine warmth that softened the edges of his usual gruff demeanor. Well then, welcome to the family, Ezra. The words, simple yet profound, seemed to shatter the tension. Hammer clapped Mike on the back, a rough but heartfelt gesture. Bones grinned, a rare sight. The other Vipers, initially stunned, now offered their own gruff congratulations, a mixture of shock and reluctant acceptance in their eyes. Mike felt a wave of profound relief wash over him. His brothers, his chosen family, were accepting him, accepting Ezra. We need to talk, Mike, Viper said, his voice firm, drawing Mike aside. About Roxy, and about Sarah, and about everything else. But first, he turned back to Ezra. How about we get you some breakfast, little man, and then we'll figure out what comes next. Ezra's small smile was a beacon of hope in the tumultuous sea of Mike's life. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Mike didn't feel alone. He had a son, and a family, perhaps broken, but undeniably resilient, ready to face whatever came their way. A chilling warning. The rumble of the bikes had softened to a low thrum against the asphalt, a familiar heartbeat that usually soothed Mike. Now, it felt like a dull ache behind his eyes. He watched Ezra, small and unyielding, sitting between Viper and him on the worn leather bench in the clubhouse, a silent sentinel. The boy's gaze, steady and unwavering, darted from one weathered face to another. A silent assessment. Viper, usually a force of nature, seemed almost gentle. The way he kept glancing at Ezra, a flicker of something akin to awe in his hard eyes, was a sight Mike doubted he'd ever witness again. "So, the kid's got a right to know," Viper finally said, his voice rougher than usual. As if wrestling with unfamiliar emotions, he gestured vaguely at Mike. "And he's got a right to his father." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered men. The initial shock had given way to a strange sense of protective solidarity. Mike felt a tightening in his chest. These men, his brothers, were accepting Ezra without question, a testament to the unspoken code that bound them. "We'll figure out Roxy," Hammer said, his voice a low growl. "No one messes with one of ours and walks away clean." Mike nodded, a grim resolve settling over him. The anger, a cold, hard knot, had been simmering since Ezra's revelation. Roxy, the woman he loved or thought he had, plotting his demise with a smile. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, Viper pulled Mike aside. Ezra was with Twitch, captivated by the older man's stories of cross-country runs. "Sarah. She was a good woman, Mike," Viper began, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Met her years back, before you were even in the club. We had a brief thing. She was smart, spirited, knew how to handle herself." Mike stared, a new layer of shock washing over him. Viper and Sarah. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. Sarah's faith in Viper, the almost paternal concern in his eyes for Ezra. "She told me she was pregnant after we parted ways," Viper continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Said she didn't want to tie me down, not with the life I was living. I respected that. We stayed in touch, off and on. She always spoke highly of you, Mike. Said you were a good man, a solid man, someone who deserved to be a father." He turned to Mike, his eyes piercing. "She made me promise I'd look out for you, and for him, if anything ever happened to her." She knew about Roxy, Mike. She suspected something was off. The words hit Mike like a physical blow. Sarah, protecting him, even in death. The depth of her love, her foresight, was overwhelming. A wave of grief, fresh and sharp, washed over him. "Roxy's got connections, Mike," Viper said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his vest. It was a photocopy of Sarah's letter, the part detailing Roxy's scheme highlighted. "Sarah did her homework. This isn't just about insurance. Roxy's got family ties to the Serpents, a rival club. They've been trying to muscle in on our territory for months. This was a calculated move. Get you out of the way, create chaos, then swoop in." Mike's blood ran cold. This was bigger than a scorned lover seeking a payout. This was war, cloaked in domestic deception. The Serpents. He knew their reputation. Ruthless, cunning, and always looking for an advantage. "We need to be careful," Viper warned, his voice low and serious. "Roxy won't go down easy, and neither will her family. This is going to get messy. We need to move fast, before they realize we're onto them." Mike felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp. The numbness that had settled over him after Ezra's revelation began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination. He had a son now, a legacy to protect, and a score to settle. "What's the plan?" Mike asked, his voice tight with resolve. Viper's lips thinned into a grim line. "First, we secure Ezra. He's our priority. Then we gather more intel. We need to know who else Roxy's brought into this. Who among the Serpents is pulling the strings. And then we hit them where it hurts." He clapped Mike on the shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. "This ain't just about you anymore, Mike. This is about us, about our family. And no one threatens our family and gets away with it." The words resonated deep within Mike. He looked over at Ezra, who was now laughing at something Twitch had said. A bright, innocent sound in the fading light. A fierce protectiveness surged through him. He would fight for Ezra, for Sarah's memory, and for the club that had always been his anchor. The chilling warning about the Serpents only solidified his resolve. The game had changed, and he was ready to play. That night, as the stars began to prick the inky sky, Mike found himself watching Ezra sleep. The boy curled up on a cot in the clubhouse, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating his peaceful face. A new kind of quiet had settled within Mike, a fierce, unwavering resolve. He had a reason to fight, a reason to live, beyond the roar of the engine and the camaraderie of the road. He had a son, and a war brewing on the horizon, Lily's poison. The cloying scent of disinfectant, usually masked by stale beer and exhaust fumes in the clubhouse, was particularly sharp that morning. It clung to Mike's denim vest and scraped against his throat with every breath. He stood by the infirmary door, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Inside, Lily lay in a cot, her face a pale, unfamiliar mask against the white pillow. The vibrant streaks of purple and green that usually highlighted her hair were dull, faded by the fluorescent lights. Doc, the club's grizzled medic, emerged, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. His eyes, usually crinkling with good humor, were grim. "She's stable, Mike, for now, but her system's taken a hell of a hit. The toxicology report came back." He paused, his gaze sweeping over Mike's face. "It's aconite, wolfsbane. Traces of it in her blood, enough to explain the rapid onset of symptoms." Mike's jaw clenched. Aconite. The same poison Roxy had used. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow. Lily, the club's quiet, observant mechanic, had been another casualty of Roxy's insidious plot. How long has she been exposed?" he managed, his voice rough. Doc sighed, running a hand over his bald head. "Hard to say precisely. The levels suggest repeated small doses. Enough to weaken her, make her vulnerable, before the final larger dose that landed her here." He pointed to a small clear bag containing a delicate silver locket. "We found this on her. Viper thinks it might be relevant." Mike took the locket. It was cold against his palm, intricately engraved with a single blooming lily. He flipped it open. Inside, tucked behind a tiny faded photograph of a young woman he didn't recognize, was a minuscule scroll of parchment. He unrolled it carefully. The handwriting was elegant, almost artistic. "Beware the serpent's kiss, for it hides a deeper venom." He frowned, the cryptic message doing little to illuminate the situation. "What does this mean, Doc?" "Lily was always a step ahead, seeing things others missed," Doc mused, his eyes distant. "She had an intuition about people, a quiet way of noticing details. Maybe she knew something was up, tried to warn us." Just then, Viper's heavy boots echoed down the hall. He entered the infirmary, his presence filling the sterile space with a charge of raw power. He looked at Lily, a flicker of something akin to pain in his usually impassive eyes. "She worked on that serpent bike, the one we seized," Viper rumbled, his voice low and gravelly. "Said she found something odd about the fuel line, but couldn't put her finger on it. We dismissed it as her usual meticulousness." A cold dread began to coil in Mike's gut. "The fuel line," he repeated, a sudden, horrifying thought taking root. "She was working on the bike Roxy rode, the one she crashed." Viper nodded. "Exactly. Lily's notes indicated she suspected a foreign agent in the fuel. We thought she meant an additive. But what if she meant a delivery system?" Mike's mind raced, connecting the fragmented pieces. "Roxy, the serpents, the poison, Lily." He remembered Roxy's bizarre fascination with plants, her garden of exotic and often dangerous flora. He remembered the strange, almost sickly sweet odor that sometimes clung to her. "She was using the bike," Mike breathed, the realization chilling him to the bone. "She wasn't just poisoning me directly. She was using the bike as a slow-release dispenser, contaminating things Lily touched, things I touched." Doc's eyes widened. "The fuel line, the grips, the seat. Any surface she worked on, any tool she used, small insidious doses." Viper's fist slammed against the doorframe, making the plaster dust. "That manipulative bitch. She wanted to spread it like a goddamn plague." He turned to Mike, his gaze intense. "This locket, it's a warning. Lily saw something. She tried to tell us, but we were too blind to see it." He gestured to the parchment. "The serpent's kiss? It wasn't just about Roxy. It was about the club and the infiltration." "Ezra," Mike whispered, his blood running cold. "If the poison was aerosolized or transferable by touch, how many other surfaces had been contaminated? How many other people had been exposed? The clubhouse was a hub of constant activity, a place where shared tools, shared spaces, were the norm. "That's why we're sweeping the entire clubhouse," Viper stated, his voice firm. "Every inch, every surface, every tool. We're going to find every trace of that poison, and we're going to eradicate it. And we're going to find out who else knew, who else was involved." Mike looked down at the locket in his hand, the delicate Lily, a stark contrast to the venom it spoke of. Lily, in her quiet way, had been trying to protect them all, even as she herself fell victim. He clenched his fist around the locket, a new resolve hardening in his chest. "And then," he said, meeting Viper's gaze, "we make Roxy and the Serpents pay. For Lily. For Ezra. For every one of us." The game had escalated. It was no longer just about Mike's survival or Ezra's parentage. It was about the very lifeblood of the club, about the insidious rot that had tried to poison them from within. The first clues. The clubhouse, usually a cacophony of engines and boisterous laughter, was eerily quiet, a tomb of anticipation. Every surface, from the scarred bar top to the worn leather of the couches, was being meticulously scrubbed by gloved hands. Mike, still reeling from the discovery of Lily's poisoning, watched the grim procession. Viper, his face a mask of cold fury, directed the operation, his voice a low growl that cut through the silence. "Gloves and masks, everyone!" Viper commanded, his gaze sweeping over the club members. "Anything she touched, anything that's been in contact with that bike, gets disinfected. And I mean everything." Ezra, surprisingly calm amidst the chaos, sat at a corner table, diligently drawing in a sketchbook. The vivid colors of his crayon stood in stark contrast to the somber mood. Mike found himself drawn to the boy, a silent anchor in the storm. He pulled up a chair, the scuff of its legs a loud intrusion. "What are you drawing, buddy?" Mike asked, his voice softer than he intended. Ezra held up the sketchbook. It was a detailed rendering of a motorcycle. But instead of the usual chrome and black, it was adorned with tiny, intricate patterns of green leaves and delicate flowers. "It's Lily's bike," he said, his brow furrowed. "But I made it better, so the bad stuff can't get in." A pang of guilt twisted in Mike's gut. He hadn't even considered how this might be affecting Ezra, the constant threat looming over their lives. "That's a really thoughtful drawing, Ezra. I bet Lily would love it." He ran a hand through the boy's hair, a silent promise of protection. Later, in Viper's office, the air hung heavy with the scent of disinfectant and unspoken rage. Viper slammed a crumpled piece of paper onto the desk. This was in Lily's toolbox, a note from Roxy. Mike leaned closer, his eyes scanning the elegant, flowing script. It was a series of numbers and letters, seemingly random, interspersed with vague instructions about a package and a drop-off point. It looked like a coded message, but without a key, it was gibberish. "What the hell does this mean?" Mike muttered, frustration mounting. Viper rubbed his temples. "It's a dead drop, a way to communicate without leaving a digital trace. Roxy's not stupid. She knows we're watching her." He paused, his gaze hardening. "The package, I think it's the aconite. She's been getting more of it in." Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place for Mike. "The seized bike," he said, remembering the fuel line. "She wasn't just poisoning Lily. She was using that bike as a delivery system. Every time someone touched it, every time it was refueled, it spread the poison." Viper nodded, his jaw tight. "And that's what I'm thinking, and the locket Lily found. That's our first real lead. It connects Roxy directly to the poison." He pushed a small, intricately carved silver locket across the desk. It was delicate, almost fragile, with a tiny, almost imperceptible engraving on the back. A stylized serpent coiled around a thorny rose. "The Serpents," Mike whispered, the name a bitter taste in his mouth. "Exactly," Viper said, his voice laced with venom. "This isn't just Roxy's vendetta anymore. She's working with them, and if they're involved, this is going to be a full-scale war." Just then, Gator, one of the club members tasked with sifting through Roxy's seized belongings, burst into the office, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. He held up a small, leather-bound journal. "Boss, you're not going to believe what I found in Roxy's saddlebag. Looks like her personal diary." Viper snatched the journal, his fingers almost tearing the fragile pages. He flipped through it, his expression shifting from grim determination to a flicker of something akin to horror. "She's been documenting everything," he said, his voice barely audible. The dates, the methods, the dosages, even the names of people she's been slowly poisoning. Mike felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Who else? He demanded, his voice hoarse. Viper's eyes met his, filled with a grim certainty. Everyone, he said, the word a heavy weight in the suddenly silent room. Everyone who's been around her, around that bike. This isn't just about Lily. This is about us. All of us, he pointed to a page in the journal. And look here. A coded entry right next to the locket. It says, "The heart of the serpent holds the truth." The locket in Mike's hand suddenly felt heavier, its delicate engravings now sinister. The serpent and Rose. It wasn't just an emblem. It was a clue. The truth was hidden within the locket itself. He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers clumsy with urgency, and with a soft click, it sprang open. Inside, nestled against a faded photograph of a younger Roxy, was a miniature, tightly rolled piece of parchment. He carefully unfurled it. It was a map, crudely drawn, but unmistakably of the surrounding area, with a prominent X, marking a remote, overgrown corner of the serpent's territory, and, beneath the X, a single word, scrawled in Roxy's unmistakable hand, Viper's Cache. Mike's blood ran cold. Roxy wasn't just poisoning them. She was systematically dismantling their club, piece by agonizing piece. She was going after Viper's most vulnerable point, his hidden assets, his leverage. This wasn't just revenge. It was an act of war, calculated and precise. A trip to the library. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the public library was a stark contrast to the roar of their engines. Mike felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, a product of being out of his element. He'd only been in a library a handful of times in his life, usually dragged along by a well-meaning schoolteacher. Viper, surprisingly, seemed at ease, his large frame somehow less intimidating amidst the towering shelves of books. Ezra, however, was in his element, eyes wide with wonder, a nascent scholar amidst the ink and paper. "This is it," Viper rumbled, pointing to the map from Roxy's locket. The faded lines traced a path from the old clubhouse to a section of the city Mike barely recognized. Viper's Cache, the elegant script had declared. Viper's secret stash of what exactly? Weapons? Money? Information? The ambiguity gnawed at Mike. Ezra, ever the observant one, spotted a discrepancy. "The map's old, Dad," he said, tracing a finger over a faded street name. "Some of these roads aren't here anymore." Mike leaned in, a pang of pride for his son's sharp mind. Ezra was right. Urban development had a way of erasing old landmarks. "We need a more current map," Mike stated, scanning the vast room. Viper grunted, his gaze fixed on a distant section. "Microfiche," he muttered, a word Mike hadn't heard in years. "Old newspapers, property records. They keep them down there." He pointed towards a dimly lit corner. They navigated the labyrinthine aisles, the scent of aged paper and dust filling their nostrils. The microfiche reader was a relic, a bulky machine with a green-tinted screen. Viper, with surprising dexterity, began loading reels of film. Mike watched, a silent observer, as the grainy images of old city maps and property deeds flickered across the screen. "There," Viper finally said, his voice a low growl of triumph. He pointed to a section of the map that had been a dense forest on Roxy's version. Now, it was an industrial park. The old lumber mill. My grandfather owned it. Used to have a network of tunnels under it. Back in Prohibition. Mike's eyes widened. Tunnels. That explained the cache part. A shiver ran down his spine. Roxy had been thorough. She hadn't just wanted to poison the club. She wanted to dismantle Viper's legacy, to sever his roots. "But the mill's gone now," Ezra pointed out, his brow furrowed. "It's a storage facility," Viper nodded. "Exactly. A lot of those old tunnels would have been sealed off, but there's always a way in. A ventilation shaft, a hidden entrance for the old speakeasy." The next few hours were a blur of scrolling through property records, architectural blueprints, and city planning documents. Mike found himself surprisingly engaged, piecing together the puzzle alongside Viper and Ezra. It was a different kind of fight, one waged with intellect rather than fists, and Mike realized he was just as determined to win it. They discovered that the storage facility, owned by a shell corporation, had been recently acquired. The new owners were unknown, their names obscured by layers of legal maneuvering. It screamed serpent involvement. Roxy hadn't just found Viper's cache. She'd led the serpents right to it. They're after something specific, Mike deduced, tapping a finger on a blueprint of the old tunnels. Not just to destroy it, but to claim it. Viper's jaw tightened. My father's ledger, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He kept records of everything. Names, deals, alliances. It's a history of this club, the good and the bad. If the serpents get their hands on that... He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were clear. Blackmail, leverage, the systematic destruction of their reputation. Ezra, who had been quietly absorbing everything, suddenly spoke up. There's a maintenance tunnel right here, he said, pointing to a small, almost imperceptible line on a faded schematic. It connects to the old sewer system. It wouldn't have been sealed when they built the new facility. Mike and Viper exchanged a look. Ezra's mind, untainted by assumptions and years of club lore, had found the forgotten path. The small boy, who had walked into Mike's life with a bombshell, was now their unexpected guide. Good job, kid, Mike said, ruffling Ezra's hair. A genuine smile touched his lips. This was their family, in their own way, fighting for their future. The library, a place of quiet contemplation, had become their war room. As they gathered their notes and prepared to leave, Mike felt a surge of resolve. The serpents might have Roxy and her twisted schemes, but they had something far more potent. A family united, and a plan. The package Roxy had mentioned, the one that would supposedly seal the club's fate, was now within their grasp, and they would get there first. Sarah's secret box. The scent of damp earth and stale water hung heavy in the air, a metallic tang that clung to their clothes as they navigated the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the city. Mike, Viper, and Ezra moved with a practiced caution, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness, each beam a solitary sentinel against the unknown. The forgotten maintenance tunnel, a stroke of genius on Ezra's part, had led them into a section of the Prohibition-era network previously unseen, even by Viper. This is it, Viper's voice, usually a gravelly rumble, was a hushed whisper, barely audible above the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere ahead. My father's ledger. It has to be around here. Ezra, surprisingly unfazed by the subterranean gloom, pointed his small, powerful flashlight toward a section of crumbling brick. Look, a different kind of mortar here. Like it was patched up later. Mike knelt, running his hand over the rough surface. Good eye, kid. This whole section feels off, like it was added or hidden. He noticed a faint outline in the brickwork, a rectangular indentation that wasn't quite flush with the rest. He pressed against it, feeling a slight give. Careful, Viper warned. But Mike was already prying. With a groan of protest, a small section of the brick wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, dusty crawl space. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs and decades of grime, sat a tarnished metal box. It wasn't large, no bigger than a shoebox, but the weight of its significance pressed down on them all. Sarah's secret box, Viper breathed, his voice laced with a bittersweet memory. My mother's. She kept everything in there. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The latch, though old, clicked open with surprising ease. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed lace, lay a stack of neatly bundled papers. The first item Viper pulled out was a small leather-bound book, the Ledger. Its cover, embossed with a faded serpent emblem, seemed to pulse with a silent history. He flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning the elegant script, each entry a record of the club's past, its triumphs, its tragedies, its very foundations. This is it, Viper confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. The history, the connections, the original members, everything. He passed it to Mike, who felt the weight of generations in his hands. Below the ledger, Mike discovered a hidden compartment. He pulled out a worn photograph. It was a picture of Viper's mother, Sarah, younger, her eyes bright with a mischievous spark, standing beside a man Mike didn't recognize. The man had a striking resemblance to Viper, a ghost from the past. Who's this? Mike asked, handing the photo to Viper. Viper's gaze softened. That's my uncle, Silas. My mother's brother. He vanished years ago. Before I was born. A shadow crossed his face. There were rumors. He had a falling out with my father. Something about a woman. Ezra, ever observant, noticed a faint, almost invisible inscription on the back of the photograph. He carefully traced the letters with his finger. The Owl's Nest, October 19th, 68. The Owl's Nest, Mike repeated, the name ringing a faint bell. That's a bar, isn't it? An old one, out near the old logging trails. Viper nodded slowly. It was. A serpent's haunt, back in the day. But it closed down years ago. Turned into a private residence, I think. He looked at the photo again, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Silas and my mother were close. If she kept this, there's a reason. Beneath the photograph, nestled in the same compartment, was a small, ornate silver locket, different from Roxy's. This one was heavier, its surface intricately carved with symbols that seemed both familiar and alien. It looked like a smaller, more delicate version of the serpent's emblem, intertwined with something else. Something that resembled a stylized owl. This was my mother's too, Viper said, his voice softer now. She never let anyone touch it. Said it was a good luck charm. He unclasped it, revealing not a picture, but a tiny folded piece of parchment. Mike took it carefully, unfolding the brittle paper. The words were written in a delicate, almost spidery hand, in a language he didn't recognize. It's Latin, Ezra said, his eyes scanning the script. It says, when the owl flies, the serpent sheds its skin. The truth lies within the nest. A sudden sharp clang echoed through the tunnels, sending shivers down their spines. It sounded like metal scraping against a stone, close, too close. They're here, Mike whispered, his hand instinctively going to the pistol holstered at his hip. The air grew colder, heavy with a new tension. The serpents had found their way in. The race for the ledger, for the truth, was far from over. It had just begun. Viper quickly resecured the ledger, the locket, and the photograph, tucking them into his jacket. We need to move. Now. He glanced at Ezra, a fierce protectiveness in his eyes. Stay close to me, son. Ezra nodded, his young face set with determination. He wasn't a boy anymore, not down here. He was a part of this, a crucial link in a chain that stretched back decades. Another clang, louder this time, followed by the muffled sound of voices. The serpents were definitely closing in. The narrow confines of the tunnel offered little room for evasion, but Mike knew they had to find a way out, and fast. The ledger was in their possession, but getting it out of the tunnels and into the light was another battle entirely. The truth, as the locket foretold, was indeed within the nest, but the nest was now under siege. Justice and new beginnings. The escape from the tunnels was a blur of adrenaline and muffled thunder. The serpents, hot on their heels, were close enough to hear their guttural shouts echoing through the damp stone. Mike, Viper, and Ezra burst from a hidden grate behind the old brewery. The night air sharp contrast to the stale tunnel. They scrambled onto their bikes, engines roaring to life with a primal urgency. Viper, with the ledger tucked securely in his jacket, led the charge, the other two a tight formation behind him. The city lights blurred as they wove through back alleys, the rumble of their choppers a defiant roar against the impending chaos. Back at the clubhouse, the atmosphere was a mix of grim determination and simmering fury. The serpents, it turned out, had not only been after the ledger, but had also managed to ransack the medical supplies, taking what they needed to treat their injured from the tunnel skirmish and destroying the rest. Lily, pale and shaky, recounted the raid, her voice laced with anger. They took the last of the antibiotics, she choked out, her gaze fixed on a splintered cabinet, and the pain meds. Mike felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't just about the ledger anymore. It was personal. He watched Lily, her hand trembling as she touched the shattered glass, and a fierce protectiveness surged through him. He caught Viper's eye, a silent understanding passing between them. We need to go after them, Mike stated, his voice low and steady. Now, Viper nodded, his expression grim. They're holed up at their old warehouse on the waterfront. Roxy will be there. The ride to the Serpent's warehouse was a tense, silent affair. The air crackled with anticipation, the hum of their engines a prelude to the storm. As they approached, the warehouse glowed with an eerie, intermittent light, the sound of distant shouts filtering through the night. Mike dismounted, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his knife. Inside, the scene was a tableau of chaos. Serpents milled about, some tending to wounds, others shouting orders. In the center, Roxy stood, a triumphant sneer on her face, holding a small vial. Her eyes, glittering with malevolence, met Mike's across the warehouse floor. Well, if it isn't the happy family, she drawled. her voice dripping with venom. Come to collect your inheritance? She gestured to a large bound volume on a nearby table. The ledger. Viper stepped forward, his voice a low growl. It ends tonight, Roxy. Her laugh was brittle, humorless. Does it? Or does it just begin? She lifted the vial. You see, Viper, I've had a lot of time to think. About you, about your family, about everything you took from me. Ezra, who had remained hidden behind Mike, now moved into view, his small face etched with a mixture of fear and defiance. You tried to hurt my dad, he accused, his voice surprisingly steady. Roxy's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark passing through them. And who are you, little man? He's my son, Mike said, stepping protectively in front of Ezra. And your game is over. Just then, the warehouse doors burst open, and a wave of enforcers, led by a stern-faced Captain Davies, flooded in. Davies, his gaze sweeping over the scene, nodded curtly to Viper. We received an anonymous tip about illegal activities, Viper. Looks like we arrived just in time. Roxy's face contorted in a snarl. You set me up. You set yourself up, Roxy, Viper retorted, his voice devoid of emotion. Justice has a way of finding its own path. The enforcers moved quickly, disarming the serpents. Roxy, cornered and desperate, made a lunge for the ledger. But Viper was faster. He snatched it, securing it once more. Davies approached Roxy, handcuffs gleaming in his hand. Roxanne Vance, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and illegal possession of controlled substances. Her protests were shrill, but futile, as she was led away. As the enforcers cleared the warehouse, a sense of weary relief settled over Mike. He looked at Viper, then at Ezra, a new understanding blooming in his chest. Later, back at the clubhouse, the ledger lay open on the table. Its pages, filled with Sarah's elegant script, detailed not only the club's finances but also Silas's research into a criminal network that had been systematically extorting local businesses for decades, and the names of the corrupt officials protecting them. The locket, now fully understood, was a clue to this nest of corruption. Silas was trying to expose them, Viper murmured, tracing a finger over a faded entry. That's why he vanished. And that's why Roxy wanted this, Mike added, to control that network and turn it against us. Ezra, perched on a stool, listened intently. So, we can stop them now? Viper looked at Mike, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. We can, son. We can finally bring justice to Silas. And to our club. The air in the clubhouse felt lighter. A weight lifted. The battle wasn't over, but the path forward was clear. Mike looked at Viper, a sense of camaraderie solidifying between them. Their lives, once so separate, were now inextricably bound by blood, loyalty, and a shared purpose. It's a new beginning, Mike said, his voice quiet but firm. For all of us. Father and son. The interrogation room hummed under fluorescent lights, a stark departure from the shadowy tunnels and explosive clashes that had defined their recent existence. Mike sat across from Captain Davies, the heavy ledger between them, open to Silas's meticulous entries. Viper stood by the two-way mirror, a silent sentinel, while Ezra, surprisingly tranquil, sketched in a corner, an oasis of youthful innocence amidst the adult machinations. Silas was sharp, Davies murmured, tracing a finger down a column of dates. He wove connections where others saw only disparate threads. This is monumental, Mike. Far beyond Roxy's personal vendetta. Mike nodded, the weight of the ledger's revelations settling. She wasn't just pursuing us. She was constructing an empire, leveraging the club's dormant network, the very one Silas was laboring to expose. The irony stung. Roxy, in her twisted quest for retribution, had inadvertently handed them the key to a vast criminal enterprise. The names etched here, Davies continued, aren't petty criminals. We're talking judges, city council members, even some of my own people. It's a malignancy, Mike, and Silas was trying to excise it. Viper turned, his expression grim. So what now? We hand it over, and they just round everyone up? You truly believe it'll be that simple? Davies met his gaze, a flicker of weariness in his eyes. No, Viper. Simple it won't be. This ledger is merely the prologue, a map, not the destination. We'll need more proof, more testimony, but it's a vital first step, and with Roxy neutralized for the moment, a window of opportunity is opened. The discussion pivoted to the intricate logistics of securing further evidence. The delicate dance required to dismantle powerful figures without prematurely alerting them. Mike found himself an active participant, offering insights into the club's veiled operations, the unspoken covenants of their world that Davies, despite his experience, couldn't fully grasp. Viper, unexpectedly, corroborated his points, adding corroborating details. It was an unusual alliance, forged in fire and shared purpose. Yet it felt undeniably right. Later, exiting the precinct, city lights casting long reflections on the wet asphalt, Ezra approached Mike, his small hand slipping into his father's larger one. "Dad?" Mike squeezed his hand. "Yeah, son. Are we safe now?" The question, artless and direct, cut through the din of their adult concerns. Mike knelt, bringing himself to Ezra's level. "Safer, buddy. Much safer, but we'll still be vigilant, always." He glanced at Viper, who stood a few paces away, observing them with an unreadable expression. "We're a team now, remember? A family, and we protect our family." Viper joined them, placing a hand on Ezra's shoulder. "He's right, kiddo. Always." His voice, usually gruff, held a subtle softness. "We've got a lot to teach you about staying safe, about discerning who to trust and who not to." A comfortable quiet settled between the three as they walked towards their bikes. The tension that had been a constant companion for weeks seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a cautious optimism. The club, once a splintered entity, felt as though it was beginning to mend. Back at the clubhouse, the atmosphere had shifted. The usual boisterous laughter and clinking of bottles were subdued. Members sat in hushed groups, a quiet hum of conversation permeating the space. The Serpent's attack, the ransacked infirmary, and Roxy's dramatic reveal had profoundly shaken them. Mike gathered the remaining club members in the main hall. The faces looking back at him were a mosaic of relief, exhaustion, and lingering apprehension. "All right, listen up," he began, his voice cutting through the hushed tones. "Roxy's been arrested. The ledger is with Davies. It's going to be a protracted struggle, but we now have a genuine chance to cleanse the city, and in doing so, secure our own future." He looked at Viper, who offered a slight nod of encouragement. "This club," Mike continued, "has endured so much. We've lost good people. We've stumbled, but we've also stood united, fought fiercely, and emerged stronger." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over each face. "It's time to rebuild. Not merely the infirmary, not just our defenses, but our reputation. We're no longer just a collection of outlaws. We're guardians. We protect our own, and we shield this city from the very corruption Roxy sought to exploit." A murmur of agreement resonated, a renewed sense of purpose flickering in their eyes. Mike then turned to Ezra, who stood beside him, holding his hand. "And this little man right here, he is part of our future. He reminds us why we fight, why we strive for something better." The ensuing days were a flurry of activity. The infirmary was meticulously restocked, new security measures were woven into the clubhouse's fabric, and Mike, Viper, and Davies convened, frequently strategizing their next moves. The ledger became their gospel, its cryptic entries slowly yielding their secrets. They identified key players in the corruption network, carefully choreographing how to approach each one without alarming the others. One evening, Mike found Viper in the garage, meticulously polishing his bike. The rich scent of oil and chrome hung in the air. Mike leaned against a workbench, observing him. "You know," Mike started, "I never imagined I'd be collaborating with a cop to dismantle a criminal network. Or with you, for that matter." Viper grunted, not looking up. "Life's full of unexpected turns, isn't it? Especially when you've got a kid depending on you." He finally met Mike's gaze, a rare softness in his eyes. "You're good with him, Mike. Better than I ever was." Mike shrugged. "We're both learning. And he needs both of us, Viper. He needs a father." Viper paused, the polishing cloth still in his hand. "Yeah," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "Yeah, he does." He looked at his bike, then back at Mike. "So what's the agenda for tomorrow? Another deep dive into Silas's chicken scratch?" Mike grinned. "Something like that. We're going to begin peeling back the layers, Viper. One by one. And this time, we're doing it together." The air in the garage felt lighter, charged with a new kind of energy. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they possessed a powerful weapon, a united front, and a shared purpose that transcended old rivalries. For the first time in a long time, Mike felt a nascent sense of hope. not just for himself, but for his son and for the club's future.